Shanker, thank you so much for joining us this morning. What is the issue here with regard to the retained EU law bill, this bill that will allow ministers to pick apart that big blob of EU law that still sits on our statute book? How important is that for the UK's economic prosperity post-Brexit?
Yeah, thank you very much, Tom, for having me on. I think what you have to look at in terms of Brexit, and you referred to the number of days, the number of years, in fact, that since we've actually left the EU. What you need to do is you need to maximise the opportunities of Brexit, and I think the UK government has done a reasonable job on the external trade policy agenda. You've got to minimise the disruptions of leaving the customs union, which is things like border management, things like single trade window, best border in the world by 2025, some of these initiatives that are quite good. But the glaring error or the glaring omission is lack of domestic regulatory reform. And in fact, of all those opportunities, the domestic regulatory reform is probably the biggest one. And so that's the one where we've seen the least amount of activity. Now, we've had some financial services reform, which is good. It's a good start. But you can't. The first step in looking at reform is to pass this primary legislation, the rule bill that you referred to, that's going through the House of Commons now. But Brexit is simply a decision to have control of your own laws. What you do with that control is the critical point, obviously. And if you can either regulate badly or you can regulate better. And I think sometimes we get into this false dichotomy of it's either more regulation or less regulation. It's actually about pro-competitive regulation. And that is, so the way to do that is you look at your stock of regulation and you try to determine whether it is pro-competitive, if it's market damaging or trade damaging or whatever, and you try to amend it accordingly. And then you also critically look at forward regulation, how you promulgate regulation, and you try to introduce mechanisms to ensure that that is competitive. And the third sort of area is how you interpret regulation, which is, again, the UK's heritage of the common law system interprets regulation very differently from a civil law system. So there's three core areas. And with regard to the stock of regulation, obviously we have a big corpus of EU law. So it's easier in a sense to look at all of that, as opposed to looking at the whole stock of your regulation, which of course would be massive. But that's the step. That's the first step that we're embarking on with this bill going through the House of Commons now.